Today we're going to cover a case that'll have you questioning the adults in this child's life. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. Bianca Piper was a 13-year-old girl living in Foley, Missouri. And although Bianca was a beautiful young teenager, she really was struggling, and really to no fault of her own. She was actually being treated for her ADHD and bipolar disorder. And some reports even said that she had the mental capacity of about a second grader. And I want to note that she was 13. And although she had been prescribed quite a bit of medicine to try to control these outbursts and these emotions that she couldn't control because of her bipolar, oftentimes it didn't work. And sometimes she really just could not control her anger, and she would have an outburst, and sometimes those would even be physical, and sometimes this meant she was physical, especially to her mother. On March 10th, 2005, Bianca Piper had dinner with her mother, and after dinner, her mother asked her to do the dishes. Unfortunately, this led to an argument between Bianca Piper and her mother, Shannon Tanner, and this small argument began to escalate, and Bianca was really struggling to control her emotions at this point. So Shannon thought back to what a therapist had told her and Bianca. The therapist had suggested that Shannon put Bianca in the car, drive her a little while from the house, and let her walk back on her own to cool down. And obviously, we can all kind of question if that technique is a great technique for a 13-year-old girl to be dropped off away from her home and to walk back by herself. I mean, that doesn't seem like a grand idea considering she's only 13, she has bipolar, she has ADHD, she maybe has the mental capacity of a second grader. I cannot confirm that, but it is in some news articles. So having her walk, even if it's just a little ways from where her mom dropped her back home, doesn't sit well with me. But Shannon and Bianca had tried it the night before, and it apparently worked for her. She was dropped off a little ways from home, she walked back, she was cooled off, she was ready to get on with her evening. And so that night, on March 10th, 2005, Bianca and her mother get in the car, and instead of dropping Bianca a half mile from their home like she did the previous night, she figured a mile would be better for Bianca because she was in such an irritable state. So she drove a mile from their Missouri home and dropped Bianca off. But the thing is, it was already around 6:15 p.m. that night. It was getting dark. Bianca's mother gave her a flashlight, wished her luck, and drove back home. Apparently, as Shannon made a turn and was driving by Bianca, she slowed down, she put the window down and said, "Listen, make sure you don't get in a car with anybody, okay? You come straight home." So she reminded her what her task was and obviously reminded her of stranger danger. So apparently about an hour later, Shannon's realizing that Bianca's not home yet, and she should be. So she started to get worried enough that she got in her car and drove back to the spot where she dropped Bianca off. And as she's driving, she keeps looking each direction. She's fully expecting to see her daughter somewhere on this road. Maybe she was just walking much slower this evening and just was taking her time to cool off. So she's looking in both directions and she's trying to spot her daughter, and she drives all the way down to where she dropped her off, and there's no sign of Bianca. So obviously this would panic Shannon more. Her daughter is not on the road where she left her, and she's not at home. So Shannon goes, she picks up her boyfriend, and they go and start knocking on neighbors' doors one by one, asking if anybody has seen Bianca. But nobody had. So she goes home and she calls the police. But of course, police were like, hey, maybe she just decided not to come straight home. And this response always bothers me. I mean, this is a 13-year-old child. It doesn't matter if she decided not to come straight home. She needs to be found. I know that law enforcement has to prioritize certain cases, but when children are involved, it just feels like they should be top priority. So apparently as the night wore on, remember this is March and it's in Missouri, the temperature obviously dropped. It was getting pretty cold. I've heard reports that it was below freezing, but I've also heard that it was about like 39 or 40, which also is quite cold. And Bianca only left wearing a sweatshirt and some jeans. And of course, everybody was worried that she would not be able to survive the elements overnight. She's a 13-year-old girl. Maybe she got lost in the woods. She's only wearing a sweatshirt. She only has on jeans. She could freeze. So Shannon actually would take police to where she dropped her daughter off, and they began to search that area to make sure that there was no sign of a struggle or anything like that. They also noted that there was no sign of a hit and run, and that road specifically that they lived on really was not a well-traveled road. And Shannon would actually recall that she only saw one other car on the road that night when she dropped her daughter off. But I don't think she actually knew anything about the car. She didn't look at the license plate or know the make or model or anything like that. I'm sure she wouldn't have thought about it because she thought she lived in a safe area. So by the next morning, when Bianca didn't return home, police would launch an official investigation and they would search that that area. They brought in 100 police officers, some were on foot, some were on horseback. They brought a helicopter. There's a series of checkpoints on the road that she went missing. So every motorist and every vehicle that went through, they were stopped and questioned about her. And then volunteer firefighters apparently went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen Bianca, and if they had any sheds or garages, they would ask if they could look in there just to make sure she didn't get in somewhere to try to stay warm. They couldn't find one clue to indicate that maybe Bianca had gone into the woods and got lost or something of that sort. She just was simply not there. At the time, Shannon had a live-in boyfriend named Jim, and they were both extensively interviewed by the police. Of course, police are always going to check family members. They're typically the last person to have any contact with a victim, so they go right there and make sure that they can rule them out. And of course, since Shannon was Bianca's mother and she was the last person to see Bianca, I mean, she dropped her daughter off on a road a mile away from home in the dark. She went through a lot of scrutiny. People looked at her very suspiciously, and really, with good reasoning. And of course, Shannon was like, a therapist told me to do this, okay? Like, I was just doing what a therapist had instructed us to do to help her. And I think that's a really important point to kind of remember, that not everything a licensed professional says should be done. I know that's speaking really generally, but in this situation, I don't think Bianca walking a mile alone in the dark was a relatively good idea for anybody. At the very least, the therapist could have said, hey, have her walk, but stay behind her, walk behind her, or drive alongside her, or drive behind her, something, right? She was a 13-year-old that had ADHD, she had bipolar, her mental capacity was not up to par, she needed somebody to be watching her. And even if she didn't have all of those things, I can't say that I would want a 13-year-old walking alone on a dark street. It just, to me, sits very wrong. And I'm not trying to judge parents. I am not a parent. I don't know how parenting is. It's just how I feel about the situation. And I'm sure that comes from the fact that I read a lot of these cases and talk about them. So I feel very insecure about children being out in the world by themselves. And I know eventually they have to go out in the world, but I don't know. To me, it's just kind of unsettling. Apparently, both Shannon and Jim passed the polygraph test, and you know how I feel about polygraph tests if you've watched any of my videos. They're obviously not admissible into court for a reason. I don't really care about polygraph tests. I'm not sure they should even be used, but that is what it is. So after they passed the polygraph test, they were kind of eliminated as suspects. And I feel like that's what's wrong with polygraph tests. Even if somebody passes it, I'm not sure they should be eliminated as a suspect. Somebody passing a polygraph test really doesn't mean they're innocent. And somebody failing a polygraph test doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty. That Tuesday, Shannon and Bianca's biological father, David Piper, actually held a press conference. They basically explained that she had been in therapy since she was 4 years old, and that she did take medicine to control those mood swings because she could be pretty aggressive. So obviously now she's missing, she doesn't have her medication. Everybody's deeply concerned. But at the age of 13, she was 5'6" and 185 pounds. Honestly, she looked more like an older teenager instead of the child that she was. They're very concerned that at this point she could become confused or start hallucinating or really just get very violent and aggressive. They were very concerned about their daughter. So of course, over the next few days, police are searching this wooded area very heavily. They're looking very closely for any sign that Bianca was there, and they couldn't find anything. And Shannon believed that her daughter may be naive enough to get in the car with somebody. She firmly believed that her daughter had been abducted by this point. And I'm just going to pause right here and say that actually firmly bothers me about this case. If you're going to take a therapist's suggestion of letting your daughter walk a mile by herself, but you don't trust that she won't get in a car with somebody, why are you doing that? Why aren't you following behind her? Why aren't you just giving her space and letting her walk? Something about that just does not sit well with me. So police believe that if Bianca had been lost in the woods, that by now they would find some evidence to indicate this, or even found her, and they just couldn't find anything. So they offered a reward. Hundreds of tips came in, but they really didn't lead anywhere. And then 3 months later, after Bianca went missing, the family would end up in the paper again. But this time it seems a little more sinister. Shannon Tanner was actually arrested for assaulting her 17-year-old daughter. Shannon's daughter would actually call the police and tell them that Shannon beat her with a curling iron and punched her multiple times. The mother even threatened to tie her up and lock her in her bedroom. And when police arrived on scene, Shannon was actually still on top of her daughter. And police literally had to physically remove her off of her 17-year-old daughter. So apparently when Shannon was under arrest, she shoved a deputy and began to try to grab a broken piece of glass. And she was apparently tased after that. She was arrested, but she posted bond and was released. And although police had already cleared Shannon Tanner as a suspect in her daughter's disappearance, The media kind of had a frenzy about this. They were at least questioning her parenting skills more than ever. I mean, she's beating her daughter, she's punching her in the face, she's hitting her with a curling iron. Something about this woman is just not sitting right with the public. So obviously, the case went cold. There was just no sign of Bianca anywhere. And although they were getting lots of tips because of media presence and things like that, these tips didn't lead anywhere. And police followed up on every single one of them. They even investigated numerous potential sightings of Bianca, but they all turned out to be dead ends. And police really believed that somebody had abducted Bianca on the road that night. But that road specifically was really only used by people from that town. So the chance of it being a stranger is really slim. They really felt like it was a local of that community. And in 2007, police would actually begin to investigate someone named Michael Devlin. A 15-year-old and a 13-year-old who were abducted were actually found alive in this man's house. One of those boys had actually been missing for 4 years, and both boys had been held captive against their will. Michael Devlin was arrested and he pleaded guilty to kidnapping and child molestation, and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison. They actually formed a task force to figure out if he had abducted any other children, but they couldn't make any connections, and that task force was eventually dissolved. So of course they wanted to know if he had taken Bianca Piper. So of course they looked at this man thinking maybe he had something to do with Bianca Piper, but nothing came of it. Unfortunately, Bianca's father died in 2009, but her mother and sister are still alive and living in Missouri. So for many reasons, this case is obviously very suspicious. There's a lot of theories about what happened that night. It was rumored that there was a white pickup truck near a pond on the night that Bianca went missing. A neighbor hadn't thought much of this. They just said that maybe the person was turning around, they weren't there long, 1 or 2 minutes, and that was it. But what's even more suspicious is Bianca's sister Tiffany, the one that was assaulted by their mother, said something very strange in 2009. It's alleged that the teenager had went on to say that her sister is in the pond. The neighbor, of course, contacted law enforcement, but unfortunately nothing came of this tip. And then in June of 2012, Tiffany was actually arrested for selling 2 high school girls for sex. She would place ads online and invite men to come have sex with them. And apparently she had been sold into prostitution as well, but she wouldn't give the name of the person who sold her into prostitution for some reason. Her accomplice was eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison, while Tiffany received 8. So everything about this case just screams suspicion to me. I really question why Tiffany would make that comment about her sister being in the pond. And of course, that makes me lean towards her mother. Had Bianca and Shannon got into an argument that became aggressive, and maybe Shannon went too far and ended up killing her daughter and had to get rid of the body, and perhaps Tiffany knew about it. Maybe she saw that it happened. But again, she has kind of an abusive and tortured relationship with her mom, so would she report her mom? I don't know. And the fact that she was sold into prostitution and then wouldn't tell the name of the person that did so really doesn't sit well with me. There's something really wrong with this family. And typically abductions take place by the people you know, whether it's a friend, a family member, a neighbor. Usually the person being abducted, the victim, knows the person. It's very rare for a stranger to abduct children. But I'd love to hear your guys' theories on it, so pop them in the comments below. That's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. While you wait for the next upload, check out another video on my channel. And if you have a suggestion for a case, pop it in the comments below. See you next time.